This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast.
Ooh,
we cannot thank you enough for joining us today on this very, very special and exciting and fulfilling month that is October.
That's right, and we've got an epic today. We've got a full-blown epic today.
Yeah, it's going to be crazy. And we're so happy you are here to join us on this effed up journey, mother effers.
This one gets dark, folks. This one gets real dark.
But before we get started, if you'd like to be kept up on what we are doing, feel free to follow us on Facebook, on Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We also have a subgroup within our Facebook group called Citizens of the Milky Way. It's kind of a smaller forum where people can get together, talk, all things like that. Feel free to join that. Anyone is more than welcome to join.
Oh, yeah.
Also, a reminder that we will be at Days of the Dead in Rosemont on November 19th through the 21st.
That's right.
And we will be at C2E2 in Chicago, December 10th through the 12th. And our first live show will be on the 10th.
That's right. A live show / panel.
Yeah.
That'll be on that Friday, December 10th at 7 p.m.
Yes.
Primo slot.
Oh my gosh. We're so excited. We're working on what we're going to do now. You know, we're working on it. We're already prepping, you know.
Oh, yeah.
We're very, very excited about this.
Very excited about that.
And if one episode a week is not enough for you, fear not, because we have the answer, and it's at patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast.
Oh, yeah.
There you're going to find lots and lots of bonus content on 3 different tiers. We have a $2 tier, a $5 tier, and a $10 a month tier.
Oh, yes.
And you get multiple bonus episodes or bonus content drops every month. We have a great catalog of bonus content on there already. Feel free to check that out. Once again, that's patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast.
That's right. On Saturday, we put up our Halloween Kills spoiler cast.
We did.
For all tiers. So you can listen to that right now if you want to go to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. A lot of other fun stuff we're already working on. Maureen is going to be doing a profile.
Yes.
Of the Scranton Strangler for our Patreon, for our top tier. I'm going to be working on some other stuff for our $5, $10 tier. We got a lot of fun crap coming.
Right. We also, not fun, but interesting, we did an episode on Gabby Petito and the Gabby Petito case that is on our Patreon. I'm sure maybe some of you have wondered why we haven't really mentioned it. It's because we actually did a full episode on it.
We sure did.
Already.
We sure did.
But anyway, we're yakking and yakking.
We're yakking.
And Dylan, we need to get our shit together.
That we do.
And we need to talk about what our topic is today, quick and firm.
Oh, hell yeah.
Let's do it.
Citizens of the Milky Way, prepare yourselves, because today we are talking about the haunting of the Bell Witch.
Ooh. This one is freaky.
And it is a sprawling epic. I didn't realize how big of an epic this was.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I have a lot of sources here. Let me just run down these bastards real quick.
Okay.
First, the book An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch by M. Ingram. Next, Our Family Trouble, The Story of the Bell Witch of Tennessee by Robert Bell. The Sinister Case of the Bell Witch by Brent Swanser at Mysterious Universe. The Story of the Bell Witch by Pat Fitzhugh at bellwitch.org, and Night of the Haunter by Lloyd Rose at the Washington Post. Oh boy. Now, I just want to say something up front here.
Okay.
These sources are all over the place. Mm-hmm. The first one that was written by Ingram, he wrote that book, I think, about 50 years, 75 years after the events happened.
Wow. Okay.
The other one that was kind of my main source, the one by Robert Bell, one of the Bell children, his came out, it was after he became an adult because he was a kid when he experienced this.
Right.
This is a huge story that has been added to over the ages.
Yes.
So if this story I tell isn't exactly like the Bell Witch story you've heard before, or if the timeline of events are somewhat different than you've heard, that's totally fine. These sources, they vary wildly.
Right. And I feel like even they acknowledge that they vary wildly too. Like
they do. Some of the things are very similar, and then some things omit certain stories altogether. Some include some in detail. Yeah.
Right.
So if this isn't the same Bell Witch story you've heard, that's totally fine. I've done the best I can to put this all into one cohesive story.
Right. Also, at the time when this happened, not everyone could read or write.
Exactly.
So this story, this legend, this true story, this ghost story, this whatever you want to call it, it's up to you. It really made its way around the American South and around America through word of mouth.
And this is, keep in mind, this is the early 19th century. The word of it even spread over the ocean to like England and whatnot. So like this was a pretty damn big deal. Like this was viral before viral was a thing.
Right.
Well, the story of the haunting of the Bell Witch happens to be one of the most famous hauntings in American history. The mystery that surrounds this haunting has been the foundation for countless books, movies, stories, spin-offs. Part of what makes it one of the most famous hauntings in American history is it is the only time in this country, as far as I know, that a person's death was directly associated with paranormal activity.
Right.
That's how intense this haunting was. Also, the haunting of the Bell Witch continues to this day. There's tons of stories that area is still haunted, but for the purpose of this episode, we are focusing on the original story where it all started. This happened between 1817 and 1821, and this is some of the most terrifying stuff. Terrifying. I also want to make another note that while this haunting story, while it pertains to the Bell family, before we get too deep on them, I want to make a few things clear up front. This story takes place during the antebellum South, and the Bell family were indeed slave owners. Just wanted to state that up top because even though at the beginning of the story, the Bells may have been a, quote, happy family, we have to realize and acknowledge the mass amounts of human misery that was all around them. Obviously, the Bells are sort of the focus of this story, but I wanted to make sure we didn't glaze over that. And there's other nasty shit, too, that we'll hear about, particularly about young brides, shit like that. Well, John Bell and his wife Lucy and their 8 kids are the focus of this story. Born in 1750 in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, John Bell spent much of his youth working as an apprentice barrel maker and later pursued a career in farming. In 1782, John Bell married Lucy, his wife, who was then at the time only at the tender age of 12.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so just keep in mind, it's just,
good. It's one of those things where you're like, well, it was normal for the time, but that doesn't make it any better. It's not like, it's just because everyone was being abused doesn't mean that made the abuse any less abusive.
Exactly.
But, wow. 12.
Yeah.
12 is young.
12 is young. You can still get into a movie for like a child's price.
I think you can like go to Fuddruckers and get a deal.
You could probably still get brought crayons at the restaurant. Like they bring you crayons and like a thing to draw on.
Those rocked, by the way.
Well, the two of them settled down on a farm of their own and were quite prosperous. For 8 years, they ran one of the most successful farms in the area. Before long, they had started to have children. Some of these kids aren't involved in the story because they were already, one of the sons was away at private school or like at some sort of a school. And then like Esther, she pops up a little bit, but Esther, she got married the year this all started happening. So she was already living with her husband away. So not all of these kids are going to be integral to this story. Everything was going great until the turn of the century when in 1801, the family experienced an awful crop season. And it happened again a few years later in 1804, and that was enough for the family to decide that they needed to go find greener pastures and set out westward. Sometime during the winter of 1804-1805, the family made the treacherous journey through the mountains of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee until they finally settled down in what is modern-day Robertson County, Tennessee, also known as the Barren Plains. Now, a quick side note. This is very interesting. While they were traveling through the Brown Mountains, they were witness to what is known as the Brown Mountain Lights.
Oh, yes.
Which will be its own episode. It's sort of whether it's paranormal or UFO activity, we're not really sure, but for centuries, people have seen these strange, unexplained lights.
So weird.
In that area, and it just so happens that this family that this story pertains to happened to also see those lights on their way, which is a totally other phenomenon that we'll cover in a different episode.
But maybe they were open to things.
Absolutely.
Or something.
Or someone in that family was. And also, if I remember correctly, it wasn't just the Bell family. There was some sources say up to 11 families all travel. Because, people would travel in caravans, at a whole, it wasn't just them, but, obviously our focus is the Bell family. Well, here they settled down in the Barren Plains and soon found themselves at home in the community. Once again, it seemed as though the Bell's green thumb had returned, and for the next several years, they were once again one of the more successful farming families in the area. John even became an elder at the local Red River Baptist Church, and in the years to come, they had more children, and their youngest being Betsy and the son Robert. So years pass, and we arrive to the year of 1817. This is when things begin to get weird. It was one evening when John Bell was out walking about the farm, tending to work that needed to be done, when something caught his eye lurking in the shadows. To John's amazement, what he saw was an animal, but this wasn't like any animal John had ever seen. This animal looked like a dog, but with the ears of a rabbit.
That's so weird.
John was stunned and unsettled by this creature. Well, today, you might pull out your phone, take a photo of it, but back then you couldn't do that. The next best thing was to shoot it.
Right. Well, that just seems to be a recurring theme with things like this. Like this happened in Skinwalker Ranch.
Yep.
Maybe it's just an American thing, but
who knows?
You see it, and goddamn, you gotta shoot it.
You gotta shoot at it, baby.
That is so unsettling. It's so subtly weird.
It's very subtly weird because it's this thing that almost looks okay, but doesn't.
Oh, yeah.
It's like something was mimicking an animal but didn't quite get it right.
Right. Or it's like you are all of a sudden open and aware and able to see these animals that have always been there, but you haven't had the consciousness or the whatever to be able to see it. That's so bizarre.
Right.
That kind of thing just really freaks me out when it's almost right, but not quite. Something's just a little bit different, or, I think that would just be really, really weird to see.
For sure. Well, John drew up his rifle and fired at the creature. Apparently, he missed it because the creature ran off into the shadows and out of sight. John returned home, and his wife Lucy could see he was clearly shaken by something. He told her what he had seen, even though he didn't believe it himself. He thought maybe he was just seeing things. The Bell family, like I said, they were slave owners. Many of the enslaved people on the property reported also seeing strange animals, like a black hound that seemed to be stalking the farm, and it would freak them out. Or they would see there's some that were animals that were as big as people walking around.
Oh God, could you imagine?
Yeah, very.
This makes my chest feel like it's closing in on itself.
John's son Drew even reported seeing a strange goat bird-like creature.
No, shut it down.
And their daughter Betsy would often claim to see a girl dressed in green hanging from a tree branch, but not hanging like she had been hanged, just like how a kid will climb a tree and hang down from a limb. She was just hanging down.
And holding on, yeah.
So this began to slowly escalate. Strange things began to happen around the farmhouse. There would come strange noises, banging and knocking noises. At night, the sounds grew more menacing, as if something was gnawing or scratching at the walls and the doors.
Oh.
There would be the sound of what almost seemed like rattling chains even. The family assumed at first that maybe they had a rat problem.
Yeah, didn't they say that they thought they could hear rats just chewing on their bedposts?
Exactly, like chewing on their bedposts. But what was weird was that at night, when they were in bed and they heard this noise, this moment one of them would get out of bed to go look, the noises would stop.
Like they're just fucking with them.
Also, the sound of the noise was escalating to the point that it sounded more like a dog than a rat. It sounded like whatever was doing this was too damn big to be a rat.
No. Oh my God.
The family would tear the house apart, looking for evidence of a rat infestation or some other kind of animal, whether it be, possums or whatever, but couldn't find anything. In his book, Robert Bell says this: The demonstrations continued to increase, and finally the bed covering commenced slipping off at the foot of the beds, as if gradually drawn by someone, and occasionally a noise like the smacking of lips, then a gulping sound, like someone choking or strangling, while the vicious gnawing at the bedpost continued, and there was no such thing as sleep to be thought of until the noise ceased, which was generally between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. So this thing is keeping them up at night.
Yeah.
Well,
they got to get up early in this, if they're farming.
Well, as Robert mentioned in that last quote, the bed covers were now starting to get ripped off in the middle of the night.
Such a classic but horrifying,
yes.
scary, haunted thing to happen.
Oh, yes. Some unseen force was ripping off the bedclothes, and the kids had also started to get their hair pulled by this thing. But if anyone got the worst of it, it was Betsy. She would wake up screaming, feeling like she was being beaten. Her hair would be tied around the bedposts so that she couldn't get up. Utensils would be slapped out of people's hands, like eating utensils, and even food yanked out of their mouths at times. Betsy in particular would be physically assaulted by this entity, sometimes even being stuck with pins. Robert Bell described it in his book, saying, "Cheeks were frequently crimsoned, as by a hard blow from an open hand, and her hair pulled until she would scream with pain." Here's something interesting, though. Betsy, as we know, got the brunt of the abuse, but nearly everyone in the house got some of it as well. But what was weird was that the entity didn't touch Lucy Bell, the mother, nearly at all. If anything, it seemed like it was fond of her. And that fondness actually will only escalate throughout this story. The family wasn't only frightened, they were getting exhausted. This thing would keep them up all hours of the night, and then consider the hours, that are required for working on a farm.
Oh my
You're
God.
up early, you work all day. The family would do their best to sneak in naps while they could, but the entity was always worse at night, and it would even mess around with them in the day, too. Well, the Bell family, particularly John, didn't want to share with others what was happening to the family for fear that it might alienate them from the rest of the community. But as the attacks only got worse, the family had no other choice but to reach out. So they did to their nearest neighbor and close friend of the family, a Mr. James Johnston, who had apparently been witness to many of these unexplained events for himself. Johnston was apparently a devout Christian and would lead the family in worship and prayer at the house. He prayed for the family's protection and for answers as to what was going on. Johnston would stay the night, and right on schedule, he would be treated to the same show that the Bells were getting on a nightly basis, and it wouldn't let up until sunrise. And just a side note, throughout this whole ordeal, you'll notice, the Bells had many folks come and stay the night, see for themselves, and almost everyone went away with an experience. And this was a rural area in the early part of the 19th century, so getting there wasn't always easy. People were compelled to see this thing.
It's not like they were just like, oh, we're in town, let's go for it. It's like, no, you had to make a trip specifically to go there.
Well, Johnston took a special interest in this thing more than just wanting to be wowed by it. He did his best to observe these disturbances. And there were times when it sounded almost like someone was breathing or clicking their teeth or smacking their lips.
Oh, ew.
The locals were very empathetic to the Bells. They were afraid, obviously, of being alienated from the town, but instead, it kind of made them local celebrities. They had a guest of some kind nearly every night that would stay out of solidarity. And seeing, of course, that the young Betsy was getting the brunt of this harassment, neighboring families opened their door for Betsy to stay with them at night for her safety. And she definitely did that. But regardless of whose house she was at, that unseen force would follow her there and assault her.
No, really?
As with anything in life, there were folks who, of course, were believers and others who were skeptics. Some thought that perhaps since this thing seemed to follow Betsy around, maybe it was her doing all of this. But we're going to touch back on that later.
Okay.
Well, Johnston noticed right away that there seemed to be almost an intelligence behind these things that were happening.
Definitely. This isn't just like some random energy. Like, this seems to be an intelligent being or something.
Right, absolutely. So he made up his mind he was going to communicate with this entity one way or another. At times, he would openly address the entity out loud, saying, "In the name of the Lord, what or who are you? What do you want and why are you here?" At first, there'd be only silence, but as the days passed and Johnston kept attempting to communicate, it seemed as though he was getting a response. when asked certain questions that had a specific answer, like how many people are present or how many horses are in the barn, there would come knocks on the door or the walls or even scratching noises, but in ways that seemed to answer the question. So like if there were 4 people there, it would respond with 4 knocks. Knock, 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 knock. And at night, the family would notice what appeared to be candlelight or lantern light out in the farmyard or the fields, but when they would go look for themselves, there would be no one there. In fact, apparently one night they saw what they thought was candle or lantern light flitting around out on the property, and they thought that it was a group of the enslaved people, just playing around out in the property.
Oh, God.
And apparently
Oh, my God.
John Bell went out to say they appreciated the show, because apparently whatever they were seeing was actually kind of cool.
Right.
The way they would they thought they were putting on some sort of a thing, and John Bell went out to say, hey, this is cool.
Yeah.
But when he went out, no one's there. So weird stuff like that. And then, of course, as with many tales like this, stones would seem to be thrown at them from out of nowhere. Very poltergeisty.
Very poltergeisty. I've been actually thinking that throughout this episode, and it seems to maybe make sense with Betsy, with her age, like that this could be some kind of poltergeist activity.
Exactly. Well, seeing as how they were now getting responses, they often prompted the entity to speak, and the responses had now actually escalated to vocal responses. It started off with a sort of whistling, which grew into a whisper, and day by day the voice kept gaining strength and becoming more articulate until every person would be able to actually hear a voice. Finally, the day came when the bells got an answer loud and clear. When the entity was asked, "Who are you and what do you want?" they got the response that seemed to come from nowhere. A voice said,
I am a spirit. I was once very happy, but have been disturbed.
Apparently, the spirit had become more and more talkative, sometimes even butting into conversations when it wasn't wanted. For example, one of the sons, John Jr., was tasked with traveling to North Carolina to, check on an estate of John Sr.'s that apparently he had a stake in. The trip was going to be long and tiring, and friends were over, and they were giving John Jr. advice over the best, route to take and who to travel with, etc. Well, that's when the voice butted in telling John Jr. not to go, and that if he did, he'd have bad luck, that the estate wasn't ready, and he would go all that way for nothing and would come back empty-handed. On top of that, the entity said there was a beautiful bachelorette who was coming to town by way of Virginia. She was very wealthy, and John Jr. would be able to woo her if he stayed.
Wow.
Well, John Jr. just laughed at this and took off the next morning as planned. He would return 6 months later, just as the entity had predicted. He came back empty-handed, and a woman, just like the entity had described, had come to town, but was gone before John Jr. returned.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Trying to hook him up.
Trying to
set him up with a date.
I mean, you gotta feel bad.
I know,
You gotta
right?
feel bad when you come back home 6 months later, you're like,
Damn.
fuck.
I know, right?
That entity had my back.
Yeah. Well, the entity kept talking more and more and became more easy to understand as it did. In fact, it got to where it would quote scripture and recite sermons. It would even spill a little tea to the family about what other folks in the area were up to.
Okay.
It apparently loved to gossip. It could also apparently mimic the voices of other people to an almost indistinguishable point, and it could throw its voice too. So it would sound like someone coming from a different part of the room.
Right.
It could mimic people.
Kind of sounds like Jeff the talking mongoose.
Yes,
a
very
little
much
bit.
so. Well, people kept asking the entity questions to find out more about who it was and what it wanted. All it would tell them was that it was once a happy spirit who had been disturbed, but with no explanation further than that. Well, when someone asked the spirit, "How were you disturbed and what makes you unhappy?" the entity replied,
I am the spirit of a person who was buried in the woods nearby, and the grave has been disturbed. My bones disinterred and scattered, and one of my teeth was lost under this house, and I am here looking for that tooth.
Well, this statement reminded the family about something that had happened a few years earlier. Apparently, the enslaved people working on the land had discovered what appeared to be burial mounds. And of course, they worked around them and didn't disturb them. Well, apparently Drew Bell and another local boy were intrigued by this discovery. They had always heard that Native American burial sites, they would bury their dead often with special relics and other things. So apparently they went in wanting to dig up some treasured items.
Some grave robbing.
Well, they had brought home what was apparently a jawbone so that they could observe it under the candlelight. But when they realized there was no relics or anything attached to it, they just tossed the jawbone in frustration.
Oh, God.
It apparently hit the wall, dislodging a tooth that fell through a crack in the floor. When John Bell had saw what the boys had done, he scolded them and had the remains returned to the resting place from whence they came. But now apparently this entity was back looking for its fucking tooth.
Oh my God.
Well, John got down and started tearing up the floor looking for this tooth. They tore up the whole floor, searched the dirt underneath it until they heard the entity laughing, saying it was all a joke.
What the fuck?
Yeah, so it was just fucking with it.
Why is it doing this?
It was fucking with it. Right, so it had nothing to do with this.
So it just like made up some ghost story, like even then doing the old trope of, Native American burial,
yes.
Like, they're so mystical and like, all this stuff.
Exactly. And you can see where other people throughout history might have added elements that weren't always there, so we don't know. But yeah, apparently that's the original story,
Wow. Oh, spooky.
Well, one of the folks who had been assisting the Bell family was a reverend from the local Methodist church named James Gunn. When he asked the entity who it was and why it was bugging the Bell family, the entity responded,
I am the spirit of an early immigrant who brought a large sum of money and buried my treasure for safekeeping until needed. In the meanwhile, I died without divulging the secret, and I returned in the spirit for the purpose of making known a hiding place, and I want Betsy Bell to have the money.
Ironically enough, the member of the family that's, as of right now, getting the brunt of the assaults is at the same time, why is the spirit saying, I want this money to go to her?
Right.
A group of them went out to the location where the fortune was apparently buried. They worked all day, found nothing. They wandered back home hungry and empty-handed. And they were once again greeted by the sound of the entity laughing, saying they were a bunch of idiots for falling for another wild goose chase.
Oh my God.
Here's the thing, the entity even made fun of how they went about digging and stuff, referencing things that actually happened when they were out there, as if the entity followed them and watched them. So apparently this thing can leave the house.
That's another thing that makes me think it's more maybe poltergeisty, because it's more attached to a person rather than a place.
And from what I could tell from Robert Bell's original account, the spirits seem to be rather good at roasting folks. For example, it apparently made fun of the way Drew would use a shovel. And it not only made itself chuckle, but even Drew and the other visitors would laugh along. And apparently it would go into this routine. It would just make fun of how Drew, like, this guy can't hold a fucking shovel. And it would just like randomly, it would roast people.
He had 5 minutes?
Yeah, and like apparently the living folks would sometimes laugh along with it, like he's doing a set.
Oh my God. That's so weird.
So weird. It's such a weird relationship you'll see this family has, because on one hand they're so terrified by this thing, but at the other hand they'll get used to it almost.
Right, because at a certain point you're kind of just like, this is our life now.
Right. Well, now people were coming in from all around to get a front row seat to what was happening. And apparently the Bells welcomed everybody. Mm-hmm. They would feed their visitors, let them stay, and according to my sources, it says the family refused any offer of money. Now, in Robert Bell's book, keep in mind, he's one of the family, so he's probably very biased in his recollection of the story. But the family viewed what was happening as an affliction and not an opportunity to make money, according to him. But of course, he's always going to paint the rosiest picture, of course. People were amazed. This voice would recite word for word sermons that local ministers had delivered earlier that day that the Bell family weren't even present for.
Wow. Like, how can you explain that?
I don't know. But people who would come and visit the Bell family, who maybe were at that sermon earlier that day, could confirm that, yeah, that was literally word for word the sermon that our Reverend gave us earlier.
Oh my God.
Now, this seems, like I said, to imply that this entity can travel to nearby places on its own. In fact, it would recite sermons that were given by different reverends at the same time in different locations.
Wow.
Because, and Robert Bell in his book kind of described, because this is a very rural area, a lot of this place had not been developed. Like, they are literally, there wasn't even churches.
Right.
So a lot of times, a reverend, for example, we already know both a Methodist and a Baptist minister have been helping them. A lot of times, a minister of a specific faith would essentially make their home the church, or they would go to folks' homes as they needed them. So instead of like a church location, they might welcome folks once a week on Sundays to their place, and then throughout the week, if someone needed prayer or wanted something, they would go to their house. So yeah, so you would have different reverends doing different sermons in different parts of the town, and this thing would know those sermons. Like it could be, not that it could just leave the house, but that it could be in multiple places at once.
Right.
While the people were amazed by this, they learned quick not to get too comfortable around the entity, because it would also randomly sometimes just blurt out someone's embarrassing secrets.
Oh my God, no, this is so stressful.
And it wasn't always necessarily like dark criminal secrets.
But no, but just like embarrassing.
Right. Even though it would do that too, we'll see later, it'll call out people's real shit, you know. But it sometimes would just, just shit you wouldn't want people to know. Like bad stuff, but just things you wouldn't, So if you were getting a bit cocky, the entity might say out loud something that would embarrass you. The locals were learning that this thing could apparently spy on them when they weren't at the bells, because it would come back and give the gossip, remember?
Oh God, he's saying a lot about farts, I can pretty much guarantee that.
So as we know, the entity was perfectly happy to talk, but when people would question it and try to get it to reveal its identity, it would tell them a story to send them on a wild goose chase. First was the tooth, and then it was that buried fortune.
Right.
Well, the Reverend James Gunn was determined to get a goddamn straight answer out of this thing. He continued to question the entity, and he would specifically frame questions that kind of made it hard for it to wiggle out of. Well, after much pressing, the entity finally relented. According to Robert Bell's writings, as this is a direct quote from his book, "The witch replied, saying that Brother Gunn had put the question in a way that it could no longer be evaded, and it would not do to tell the preacher a flat lie, and if the plain truth must be known, it was nobody else and nothing but old Kate Batts's witch, determined to torment old Jack Bell out of his life."
So a witch?
A witch. Now, let's get into old Kate Batts real quick. Of course, this is a shock to everyone in the room. Kate Batts is a local woman. I think she lived about 4 miles outside of the town, so somewhat local, Not only was there animosity between her and the Bells, but apparently the whole town didn't like Batts either.
Yeah.
Now let's take a few things in here. Kate Batts is alive. It's not like she died and they think this is her goal. She's alive. So this is,
because at the time the term witch was kind of used for like anything really paranormal. So like
right, or it was a conjuration of a witch. So if it wasn't a witch, it was a product of a witch.
Right, and it was
thing.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Kate Batts' husband, I guess something had happened that it kind of left him disabled. So Kate had to essentially become the head of the household. She was in charge of the family's finances, business dealings, etc. Well, people found her to be quite abrasive, I guess. Just, she didn't take shit, apparently. She would call people on their shit all the time, was very loud, very, at least this is how they described her.
Exactly. It's interesting. It's like you wonder if she actually was loud and broad and all this stuff, or if that was just what she was thought of at the time, and really she was just a reasonable person.
Exactly.
We can't really know for sure.
Many had begun to think Kate Batts was a witch, or at the very least was dabbling in witchcraft and perhaps using that to afflict the Bells. But because of that, that's why today we call it the Bell Witch.
Right.
There is no confirmation that Kate Batts was a witch, that this thing was a creation of a witch. It's just kind of this nickname that stuck. And for the rest of this, I will probably call it the witch.
Right.
Just because that's what it's known as. It's the common parlance. Even though that was just one minor theory that we'll get into all the different theories, but just for clarification.
That one just really
stuck. Now, Reverend James Gunn did not buy this. He wasn't buying this, what the entity was saying. Plus, because it already told him so many other wild tales. But that didn't keep many of the other folks present from believing it. So whether or not Kate Batts, or the entity that's commonly referred to as Kate, was a witch or whatnot, I just thought that was interesting and should be noted.
Yeah, I think so too.
Despite the fact that the real Kate Batts apparently hated John Bell in real life, Robert Bell in his book says this quote about her. "She was kind-hearted and a good neighbor toward those she liked. I shall hereafter call the witch Kate, though not out of any disregard for the memory of Miss Batts, for after all she was a clever lady and did not deserve the cruel appellation of witch." Now, keep in mind, Robert was a small child when this was going on, but apparently, I don't know if this was just manners, but in his thing, he seemed to say, I don't think that Kate Batts was responsible.
Right, it does seem like that. That is cool.
It should also be said, John Bell was apparently not an upstanding businessman and was quite slimy and underhanded in some of his business practices. Some of the sources say the reason Kate Batts hated John Bell was that apparently he had ripped her off over the transaction for an enslaved girl. I guess she felt he ripped her off. It feels so weird saying that when you're talking about a human life.
It's like,
it feels weird to be like, oh, he ripped her off, because it's neglecting the real issue. But we don't know, though. But that was apparently the scuttlebutt of why the two hated each other.
Right.
So keep in mind that Kate Batts was also a slave owner and a piece of shit. And one more point. The entity itself was apparently also wildly racist. Mm-hmm. It would threaten and harass the enslaved people on the property, calling them, the worst things imaginable, of course. Even this ghost, or this entity, was a piece of shit. In fact, the family would occasionally even invite some of the enslaved in for dinner and to stay the night, hoping it would drive away the entity.
Oh my God.
So
Can you imagine?
Think about that. Holy shit. Not only are you enslaved, but the only time the Bell family probably showed you any real sort of decency at all was so that you could help them get rid of a ghost that the whole time is calling you the worst things imaginable.
Oh my God. What an absolute just bullshittery, tragic situation. Oh my God.
And we'll see how this maybe plays into the bigger story of what's happening. In fact, there was an enslaved person in particular named Dean. I guess he was sort of seen as a leader amongst the other enslaved people. He would often act as a kind of a mediator between the Bells and the enslaved population. He told the Bells that they were also seeing weird shit, like animals the size of humans. He confirmed we're seeing weird crap out there too.
Yeah.
By now, the legend of the Bell Witch had started to spread. It's starting to go viral.
Yeah, it's getting crazy.
It began to even attract folks of some notoriety. These crazy stories caught the attention of none other than one General Andrew Jackson.
Wow.
Who a few years later would, of course, become president of the United States.
Another piece of shit.
When Jackson had heard about this supposed haunting, he rounded up some friends of his and some fellow soldiers to accompany him. I think there was about 7 of them all together. They went down to the Bell house to have a look for themselves. Well, Jackson and his men were apparently very skeptical, but thought, hey, if anything, it'll be good for a laugh. We've been fighting the British, baby. What's a ghost gonna do? You know what I mean? Well, things started to get weird right off the bat as Jackson and his men were approaching the property. Here's how Ingram described it in his book.
Then, traveling over a smooth, level piece of road, the wagon halted and stuck fast. The driver popped his whip, whooped and shouted to the team, and the horses pulled with all their might but could not move the wagon an inch. It was dead stuck, as if welded to the earth. General Jackson commanded all the men to dismount and put their shoulders to the wheels and give the wagon a push, but all in vain. It was no go. The wheels were then taken off one at a time and examined and found to be all right, revolving easily on the axles. General Jackson, after a few moments' thought, realizing that they were in a fix, threw up his hands, exclaiming, "By the eternal, boys, it is the witch!" Then came the sound of a sharp metallic voice from the bushes, saying,
"All right, General. I'll let the wagon move on, and I'll see you again tonight."
The men, in bewildered astonishment, looked in every direction to see if they could discover from whence came the strange voice, but could find no explanation to the mystery. The horses then started unexpectedly on their own accord, and the wagon rolled along as light and smoothly as ever.
Already before they even get there. And then they hear a voice. She addressed Jackson apparently directly. It was like, all right, I'll let you go, but you're going to get another visit from me tonight.
Like, did they actually hear a voice say
Apparently
that?
they heard it come from the bushes, and they searched all around and couldn't find it.
Oh, that's so creepy.
Well, this obviously shocked Jackson and his men, as they had no explanation for this other than something supernatural. But rather than scaring them away, the once skeptical Jackson was apparently now gung-ho about staying the night at the Bell House. And they did just that. And during the night, the men waited for something to happen, even getting a bit bored apparently, as the entity had seemed to go quiet. Apparently, one of the men in Jackson's crew was a real douchebag, very boisterous, annoying, a braggart, I guess you would say. Apparently, he was overly macho, claiming that he was a, quote, witch layer. I'm not sure what that means, if that means a witch killer or it means you seduce witches.
Oh, come on.
A witch layer, maybe that means he lays with, I don't know. Well, all of a sudden, it was as if an unseen force had entered the room and begun whooping this guy's ass.
Oh my God.
Jackson and the other men watched as some invisible entity gave that annoying douchebag a hearty beating.
Oh, well, that is kind of exciting.
And it finished off the show by dragging the squealing man out of the house by his nostrils, as if it had taken its fingers and hooked into his nostrils, and it appeared as though the ghost had used its fingers to hook the man by the nostrils, lifting him just enough so that the man had to walk on his tiptoes to avoid getting his nose broken.
Oh, God.
And he was led out of the house squealing like a little pig. As frightened as Jackson and the others were, they were almost impressed by the otherworldly ass-whooping this man had, that had been laid on this man. They stayed the night and, of course, weren't allowed a moment's sleep. Constantly, Jackson and the others were getting slapped and their bed covers torn off. On top of that, a voice would insult them and tease them, saying they were, supposed to be seasoned soldiers. Apparently, Jackson and his men left first thing in the morning without even waiting for breakfast. Sources differ as to the exact quote that Jackson gave, but essentially, he said, "Rather fight the whole of the British Army than stay another night at the Bell House."
Damn.
Either way, it seems Jackson was made a believer. But quick note on this. This is interesting. It's not for sure because Ingram mentions the Jackson story of in his book. Robert Bell doesn't mention the Andrew Jackson story in his book, which you'd think would be a big deal because it's, at the time that was a local, celebrity.
Oh yeah, no, that is very odd.
Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but this story started circulating, right? It wasn't like this was a modern creation about Jackson. Right. But this is actually a pretty interesting theory, if it wasn't true, where it might have come from. Skeptics suggest that the story may have come out of the 1824 presidential election when Andrew Jackson lost to John Quincy Adams. It might have been a campaign story they beefed up to embarrass Jackson. We don't know, but that's one theory. Now, many people were witness to these events. This is where the story kind of becomes just a revolving door of people coming in and getting their ass handed to them. But there's another one I wanted to point out that happened to a family friend named William Porter, and I'm going to touch on some other ones. By now, the family had learned that if the witch was kept entertained, then it usually wouldn't act out. It was as if it was getting direct attention, that it wouldn't start throwing shit and hitting people. Well, one of the people that would regularly visit to entertain the witch was a man named William Porter, a young man, handsome bachelor. And he wasn't the only one. Other people would come and just sit and talk to the witch. And it was funny, people sometimes, Porter included, actually found her to sometimes be quite charming during small talk.
Right.
Apparently this entity was quite witty, like almost any subject she had at least some kind of knowledge of, could hold a really good conversation. People found when she wasn't slapping you and harassing you, she apparently could be a good conversationalist. And he knew also that with more small talk, this would allow the Bell family to actually get some rest. Well, Porter lived nearby in a nice-sized house, and apparently the witch may have taken a liking to Porter and crawled into bed with him one night.
Oh no, gross.
Here from Robert Bell's book, I'll read directly, is apparently what happened.
It was a cold night, and I made a big log fire before retiring to keep the house warm. As soon as I got in bed, I heard scratching and thumping about the bed, just like Kate's tricks as I thought, but was not long in doubt as to the fact. Presently, I felt the cover drawing to the backside, and immediately the witch spoke, when I recognized this unmistakable voice of Kate.
"Billy, I've come to sleep with you and keep you warm."
I replied, "Well, Kate, if you're going to sleep with me, you must behave yourself." I clung to the cover, feeling that it was drawing from me, as it appeared to be raised from the bed on the other side, and something snake-like crawling under. I was never afraid of the witch or apprehended that it would do me any harm, but somehow this produced a kind of chilly sensation that was simply awful. The cover continued to slip in spite of my tenacious grasp, and was twisted into a roll on the backside of the bed, just like a boy would roll himself up in a quilt, and not a strip was left on me. I jumped out of bed in a second, and observing that Kate had rolled up in the cover, the thought struck me, "I've got you now, you rascal, and will burn you up." In an instant, I grabbed the roll of cover in my arms and started to the fire, intending to throw the cover, witch and all, in the blaze. I discovered that it was very weighty and smelled awful. I had not gone halfway across the room before the luggage got so heavy and became so offensive that I was compelled to drop it on the floor and rush out the door for a breath of fresh air. The odor emitted from the roll was the most offensive stench I'd ever smelt. It was absolutely stifling, and I could not have endured it another second. After being refreshed, I returned to the room and gathered up the roll of bed clothing, shook them out, but Kate had departed, and there was no unusual weight or offensive odor remaining, and this is just how near I came catching the witch.
So she apparently followed him home and wanted to get in bed, and then he tried to burn her.
Whoa.
Am I right, ladies?
Yeah, guilty as charged, Henny.
Yeah.
Now they have to just continue on. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? It's like, now it's like, oh, fuck, she's still here, though.
Exactly. I don't know
And
if
now she's pissed as
I know,
probably.
right? Well, as we know, even when complete strangers who weren't even from the area would arrive, she'd already know things about them. One time, 4 out-of-town strangers came to the Bell house one night. They had heard of these stories and they wanted to see for themselves. But before the group could even introduce themselves, the witch loudly called out one of them by name, saying,
He is the grand rascal who stole his wife. He pulled her out of her father's house through a window and hurt her arm, making her cry. Then he whispered to her, Hush, honey, don't cry. It will soon get well.
The group was in stunned silence until finally a member of the Bell family asked the man in question if what the witch said was true, and he confessed that it was. So this man, sounds like he kidnapped his wife, and you gotta assume she probably wasn't of age.
No.
Sounds like he kidnapped his wife. So these people that came for a good show, once again, it would call you the fuck out.
Whoa.
Yeah, so this was fucking serious.
Oh my God, this is crazy.
Called his ass out.
Wow.
And we have a few more stories here because, of course, the family opened their door to everyone, whether they were skeptics, whether they were believers, whether they were Christians, even if they practiced witchcraft. They let everyone in. The Bell house had even grabbed the attention of one Detective Williams. Now, Williams apparently was specialized in exposing frauds, whether it was mediums or people who've claimed to live in haunted houses. He saw them all as snake oil salesmen just trying to scam honest people out of their money. Well, he came to the Bell's house and made no effort to mask his opinion that he thought this family was actually behind all of this. But nevertheless, the Bells welcomed him in to see for himself. And actually, for the first few days, the witch was silent, except for a few unexplained thuds and scratching noises. Even in front of other guests, Detective Williams would announce that it was clear that the Bells had hired folks to hide in the walls and various parts of the house in order to make these commotions that were being reported. And given his credentials as a master debunker, they were clearly too afraid to put on their usual show with him there. Despite this man's rudeness, the family had tried their best to be pleasant and accommodating. They fed him without charge, gave him a place to sleep, but this was enough. John Sr. lost his temper and threatened to throw Detective Williams out on his ass. But just then, the voice loudly interrupted, saying,
No, you don't, old Jack. Let him stay, and I will attend to the gentleman and satisfy him that he is not so smart as he thinks.
Okay.
Well, this shut everyone up immediately. Because like before, they had barely seen anything, so suddenly there's just a voice.
This voice is speaking the truth.
Yes.
Really going for it. Wow. That would be shocking.
Yeah.
That went from 0 to 60.
Williams was rattled by this, but still confident that it was a fraud of some kind. But that night, Detective Williams was treated to a first-class show just as the witch had promised. In the middle of the night, Williams felt something crawl upon him and sit on his chest. It felt like a person, but there was no one there. Just then, he was met with a barrage of slaps and fists and scratches. He screamed out for help, and in a few moments, the family had come with candles and lanterns in tow to illuminate the room. And now Detective Williams could see firsthand that whatever was pinning him down was invisible, and it wasn't any of the Bell family. The witch kept beating him and would sarcastically ask him which of the Bell family he thought was hitting him, till finally it stopped. But apparently even then, Detective Williams, he wasn't quite ready to admit defeat. He stayed up the rest of the night holding a candle in his hand, terrified as this voice mocked him and harassed him all night long, until apparently in the morning he quietly left, thanking the family for their hospitality and apologizing for his behavior.
Really?
Now here's an interesting story, because this is one of those things, kind of like Kate Batts being a witch, one of those things that was kind of a minor thing that ended up being a huge, for whatever reason, it was made a huge part of it, even though it might not have been. Betsy and a brother of hers and a local kid, they were playing on the property and they went into a cave one day that was nearby. A lot of caves in Tennessee.
Oh, yeah.
And Kentucky and whatnot. The boy, I guess, was digging stuff. He was digging in the dirt and whatnot. And apparently this caused some sort of a mini landslide and the boy got completely buried.
Oh, no.
They heard a struggle, but they couldn't see him in the dark of the cave. But that's when the witch essentially said, "Don't worry, Betsy, I'll get him." And apparently the boy was pulled out of the dirt and pulled about 12 feet away from the mouth of the cave. And he did live. He was saved. But here's the thing. Betsy made those boys promise not to tell anyone this story, which is interesting. Why, when what's maybe arguably one of the first good things the witch has done, why do you not want people to know? Let's introduce another guy, brief little cameo here, a guy named Frank Miles. Frank Miles was a local guy. I guess he was a pretty, for the time, a pretty big guy, over 6 foot, tough motherfucker. And he'd been hearing all about this stuff and how the kids were getting hurt and everything, and he'd had enough of it. Well, he went over because he thought, you know what, if the witch can hit people, maybe that witch can get hit right back.
Oh, okay. It's a witch fight.
He went over there with the idea he's going to challenge this thing to a wrestling match.
Oh, damn. Okay.
He went in and proclaimed it out loud, calling out the witch. And then apparently they heard the entity say,
"Oh, you think so?"
And right at that moment, Betsy was hit so hard, she apparently spun around.
Oh my God, like cartoon shit.
Right, almost like a Three Stooges sketch.
Oh my God.
Well, if that was enough, Frank was pissed. He lunged in the direction of wherever this thing might be, and of course, missed, fell on his ass, and the thing just laughed at him. And it kept doing that. It would kind of give him a hint of where it is. He'd lunge, or it would touch him, or it would hit Betsy, and he would lunge in that area, and it wouldn't be there, and he was getting winded. But he was still determined he was going to get his wrestling match, so he stayed the night. But that night, apparently the witch used the bedsheet to hold him down so tightly that the sheet split in half.
Oh, whoa.
Apparently he was found the next morning trembling in the corner. Frank, though, wasn't ready to quit just yet and returned a few days later with a big-ass bag of flour. He thought, kind of like in the movie Invisible Man, if he could get some flour on it or something of substance, he might be able to see it and could get his hands on this thing and whoop some ass. Well, Lucy Bell, the mother, got pretty damn pissed when Frank covered the whole goddamn house in flour and there was no witch to be seen. But apparently on his way out the door, the witch gave Frank a big kick in the ass, laughing at him, and Frank wouldn't try again.
I mean, come on.
Another story. These are, like I said, this is kind of a revolving door of just weird shit.
Yeah.
There was an Englishman traveling the countryside. He was visiting some family that I think maybe lived in Virginia. I can't remember. Maybe it was Kentucky. Or wait, maybe it was Kentucky. I can't remember. But he'd heard about the Bell Witch also, and he wanted to see for himself. And he stayed for a few days with relatively no interaction. But on his last night there, before he was going to leave, he was chatting with the Bell family and said he wanted to leave the next day because he was starting to really miss his family. Well, that night, he was kept up all night by the witch imitating the voices of his parents, like masterfully.
Right.
And apparently he left at the break of day before even saying goodbye to anyone.
Oh my God. I mean, that is another thing kind of similar to the dog with a rabbit's head or rabbit's ears.
Exactly.
Like, it's this little thing that is just really scary. Like, it might not seem scary when you first hear it, but then you think about it and it's like, this thing can completely imitate and make me believe that people I'm the closest to in the world can say anything.
Right.
Oh, God. That's tricky and that's rough.
So all the while, throughout the story, it keeps getting worse and worse. The more the family suffers, the stronger the entity seemed to become.
Yeah, and that we hear that again and again and again in these haunted house stories.
Strangely enough, though, it was only about to get worse. The witch soon introduced the Bells to 4 other entities, which was apparently a whole family of witches. Their names were Black Dog, Mathematics, Psychopathy, and Jerusalem.
Okay.
Here's how Robert describes these entities.
Black Dog assumed to be the head of the family and spoke in a harsh, feminine tone. The voices of Mathematics and Psychopathy were different, but both of a more delicate feminine tone. Jerusalem spoke like a boy.
Now, these 4 were apparently absolute monsters. They would announce themselves each with a song before they would appear. They would scream and insult the living. They were always arguing, not just with the family and beating around the family, but also with each other.
Oh, God.
Apparently, the house would sometimes begin to reek of whiskey, and all 4 of them It was clear, even though they couldn't see them, they could only hear voices. It was like they were drunk and having an argument with each other.
Weird.
And, if people tried to interact, they'd treat them as bad too. It would get to the point where apparently Black Dog would come in and tell the other entities to shut up or it was going to kill him.
Oh, wow.
Now, this started to drive off more of the neighbors that would usually come around. Now, there were a number of diehards who stuck through it all, but this started to scare people away because it seemed like it was building to something bad. The family now was seriously considering moving, but the entities told them that no matter where they went, they were going to follow them until John was dead, so it was no use trying.
I was just thinking the same thing. I was like, I don't think that's really going to matter. This thing can clearly move around. There's really no point in moving.
And they've already gotten proof that the entity will go to other places because Betsy went to other places and it followed her. Now, the family, as we know, made a point to open their door to everyone. They even allowed conjurers and mystics to take a shot at getting rid of the witch, too. One such person was a somewhat famous individual named Dr. Mize, who lived 35 miles away in Simpson County, Kentucky. He was a practitioner of witchcraft and apparently had garnered a reputation of being pretty accomplished at what he did. One early morning, Drew and a family friend, Mr. Johnson, took off towards Simpson County to ask Dr. Mize for his assistance. Sometime later that morning, back at the farmhouse, the witch showed up as she usually did to harass the family, but she immediately noticed that Drew was absent. She almost seemed worried, like she was worried about his safety. The family just sort of played coy, like they didn't know where he had gone. The witch said, well, she would just go find out for herself, and apparently took off for some time. A while later, the witch returned laughing, saying she had found Drew with Mr. Johnson on their way to meet a warlock. She said she took the form of a rabbit in order to keep an eye on them. Meanwhile, Drew and Mr. Johnson found Dr. Mize and explained to him what was going on. And he said, yeah, this was certainly out of the ordinary, but he was still confident that he could dispel this witch from the farm. So Drew and Johnson returned with Dr. Mize, and the family told them that the witch seemed to know exactly what they were up to, and they confirmed that along the way to Kentucky, they had spotted a rabbit along the trail who would watch them intensely and then would randomly appear later down the trail, like this same rabbit.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, this thing sucks, it's kind of a bad thing, but I don't know, there's something about that's just kind of cool.
The family were obviously Christians. John Bell in particular wasn't happy about having a practitioner of witchcraft in their home, but he was still polite and cordial and figured he might as well let the guy give it a shot. So Dr. Mize stayed for about 3 or 4 nights, and there wasn't really much of a peep at all out of the witch. And Dr. Mize said he wasn't surprised, as witches were usually shy around him because of his mastery of witchcraft. But he was certain that a witch was present because he got one look at a shotgun that the family had kept that hadn't worked in years. He said the witch had cursed it to rust over, and performing a quick spell, apparently the shotgun would fire as well as it ever did. It was clear that whether or not this guy was as good as he really said he was, much like Detective Williams, he was clearly full of himself. And it was time for the witch to take him down a peg.
Okay, here we go.
One evening, Dr. Mize was whipping up some sort of potion or concoction that would make the entity reveal itself when Black Dog, one of these new entities, showed up and kind of pestered the wizard, asking what it was doing. The guy, Mize, he's taken aback by this sudden voice because he's hearing nothing for a few days, and all of a sudden it's just a crystal clear voice. And he replied that it was none of their business. Well, that's when Black Dog replied saying that he had forgotten some important ingredients for that potion and it wouldn't work. Mize was kind of offended by this, as he is supposedly a master at witchcraft. So he retorted hotly, "What is that?" And Black Dog said,
"If you were a witch doctor, you would know how to aerify that mess, so as to pass it into an airform state and see the spirit that talks with you without asking silly questions."
Well, Mize was shocked by this, and also shocked by this entity's apparent knowledge of witchcraft. He asked, trembling,
"What do you know about this business anyhow?"
Apparently, Black Dog called Dr. Mize a fat piece of dog shit. Literally, a fat piece of dog shit who, quote, looks like an uncooked sausage.
Oh, that is actually dope. That is a good burn.
Absolutely. And
I like that roast.
And not only does it assault people, it will literally belittle them.
Right.
And it will show that it has a better knowledge of things than they do. This, of course, scared the shit out of Mize, and he left the first thing the next morning, saying that thing knew more about witchcraft than he did. But when he hopped onto his horse, it refused to go anywhere. It would just whinny and kick up its front legs, but it refused to go forward. Just then, the voice of the witch spoke in Mize's ear, saying she'd help the horse get on its way with a quick slap, and she'd also accompany Mize back to his home. Before Mize could even respond to this, the horse took off at a full sprint with him hanging on for dear life to the horse's mane.
Oh, no.
And apparently, the witch harassed him the whole way back home. And for weeks bragged about, when she got back, apparently bragged about all the shit she put him through on his journey home.
Oh, God.
It's also possible that this entity or entities were able to manifest themselves in human form, or possibly even as doppelgangers.
Oh, that's freaky.
One of the Bell's older children was Esther. She'd actually gotten married the year all this crap started in 1817, so she lived with her husband. Esther and her husband would regularly come and help the family out as everyone else did. One day, Esther's husband was away doing some work, so she made her way up to the lane to the Bell family's house to gather eggs from the chicken stable. The stable was located across the lane from the house, and Esther's walking up the road, and up the lane, she sees a woman walking slowly in her direction. Not slow like she couldn't move well, but just, like she's taking her time on a nice stroll. She was a bit far off for Esther to kind of see who it was, but she just shrugged it off and went to the stables, collected the eggs. She leaves the stables and she's headed back to the house. And in the lane, right in front of the entrance to the property, she sees that woman again who stopped, and she had taken off her bonnet and was actually brushing out her hair. And Esther realized that this was actually one of her neighbors that she was friendly with and pleasantly greeted her as you would. But strangely, the woman didn't respond, just kept brushing out her hair. Esther thought maybe she hadn't heard her, so she greeted her again, and once again, no response. Esther's puzzled by this and politely asks the woman if she'd like to come in for a visit and something to eat. Once again, no response. The woman just continued brushing her hair. Esther even walked right up to her. The woman seemed distracted, like she didn't even know she was there, like she was deep in thought. Once again, she'd asked the lady if she'd like to accompany her inside. Nothing. So now Esther thinks either this lady's mad at her for some reason or there's just something wrong with her.
Yeah.
So she goes inside and she calls for Betsy to have a look for herself, and they look out the window. And now the woman was actually sitting straddling the family's fence row. Just sitting there brushing her hair as she was, but now sitting on this fence row. And they watched her, this bizarre behavior, wondering what was going on. After about 5 minutes, the woman tucked her hair back up as it was before and put her bonnet back on. She then hopped off the fence and started making her way toward the stables. But this was weird because why would she be going to the family stables? She had no business being there.
Right.
So they exited the house to follow her, and that's when they saw that the woman was not alone. There were 3 other people with her, 2 girls and a boy. They crossed to where there was a knotted log that was laying on the property, and they all had a seat there. And the family knew this must be real because they watched the small sapling branches bend underneath them as they sat. Well, just then, Esther's husband, Bennett Porter, arrived. And they told him about everything that was going on. He went and got a look for himself, and he thought he'd try addressing them. And of course, they said nothing. He figured this must be some sort of conjuration by the witch. So he fetched a rifle, and at first he told Esther to take a shot. Not at them, but just in their direction, sort of, this'll get their damn attention. Esther didn't want to, so Bennett took aim and fired at the log, and just as he did, the apparitions were gone. And the bullet hit the log right where he had aimed. What's weird, though, is this is the only real instance I could find of this happening during this story. And they were never quite sure if the witch was actually to blame for this, but that night, the 4 new entities that had arrived, and they put up a big stink about it, claiming that was them, and that poor Jerusalem's arm got broken by that shot.
Oh.
So it was like Black Dog, Mathematics, whatever that other one was, and Jerusalem. It was like they had manifested.
Yeah.
But Black Dog apparently looked like a neighbor they recognized.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. A lot of this is reminding me a little bit of our Doppelgangers episode, especially the first story where the woman wasn't really acknowledging the fact that she was there.
Right.
That's so fascinating and really, really eerie.
And what's strange is over time, those 4 new entities kind of left, but the witch remained. And it makes you wonder, and I'm not really sure if the witch she would also show up while these other 4 were doing their shit, or if she like left for a while. It literally sounds like the fucking uncles from Casper, the ghost uncles, like Fatso, Stinky, and Stretch.
Yes.
They sound like that, like they're obnoxious, they fight.
It really does.
That was the impression.
That is so funny. I didn't even think about that, but it really is like that.
Now, as we established before, first Betsy and then John Sr. received the worst of the assaults. But with Betsy, what was interesting was she was constantly assaulted, but also the entity would always talk favorably about her.
Right.
Almost seemed protective of her. And over the last, because now we're a few years into it, it started off hot and heavy on Betsy, but now more of the beating is happening to John. More of the assaults are happening to John. Less on Betsy. She still would get beat up and stuff, but even at its worst, it also seemed to like Betsy somehow.
Right.
Whereas it always hated John.
Yes.
But it almost seemed to take on a protective aspect for her. And for example, Betsy had recently caught the eye of a local young single man named Joshua Gardner, who apparently was much more age appropriate for her. Keep in mind, Betsy at this time is only 14.
Yeah.
She was 12 when this started in 1817, I think. So in 1819, 1820, she's about 14 years old. And this guy, I think, was 18. Still not appropriate, but hey, at least he's not 40.
Yeah, oh my God.
You know what I mean? The family also really liked Joshua and were happy that Betsy and him really seemed to like each other. But the entity despised Joshua and would literally beg Betsy not to be with him. She'd insult Joshua and, of course, whack him around, beat him up, even visit him at his house and drive him insane.
Wow.
She didn't like him at all. So you see, once again, she abuses Betsy, but also still seems to be protective of her.
Right.
And keep all of this in mind, because Betsy's health was also being affected. Betsy would suddenly become faint and pass out. She would struggle to breathe and convulse on the floor. These spells would last for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then would almost immediately clear up with all of her energy, would come back to her. But this would happen routinely, every evening, right before the witch would arrive and keep the family up all night. It was like how they knew it was coming. Betsy would have one of these attacks.
Wow.
Apparently one day they were having a picnic even, and Joshua Gardner apparently tapped his glass to get folks' attention because he was going to make an announcement, probably to ask Betsy to marry him. But before he could, the witch actually blurted out, beckoning Betsy not to marry him, and promising that if they did, she'd follow them anywhere they went and would torture them for the rest of their lives.
What the fuck? Why? Let this girl have some happiness.
John Bell was receiving no such mercy. According to Robert Bell's book, John's symptoms first appeared as a pain in his jaw, like a stiffness in his tongue. Before long, though, it would get to where his tongue would swell to where he couldn't eat or talk for a day at a time sometimes.
Oh, wow.
His face would twitch and contort painfully. It was almost as if he had no control over his face. John's ailments just kept getting worse and worse. Sometimes the entity would leave him alone for a few days at a time, enough to recover before he would get ill again. Sometimes he would be housebound for a week or so. He would get enough strength to go out and do something, and then it would hit him again. But one October morning, the witch made clear her intentions. John had been finally left alone a few days and recovered enough that he could do some work around the farm. He asked his son Robert to accompany him to the pig pens that were located a few acres away on the property, because they were going to separate the pigs between the ones that were going to be food and the other pigs that weren't. So they were halfway to where the pig pens were, when suddenly John Bell's shoes flew right off his feet. And they knew right away what the hell was going on. Robert went and fetched his father's shoes and helped him lace them back up, laced them real tight with a double knot. They walked a bit further when suddenly it happened again. They just flew right off his feet. But when this would happen, they would just quietly put the shoes back on and continue. They got to the pig pen, and once they were there, were left alone. They did their work separating the pigs, and they started to make their way back home. But on the way back home, it started again. But this time when John's shoes flew off, it was immediately followed by a blow to the face, like an open hand slap.
Oh, yikes.
It was hard, though, and stunned John to the point that he needed to sit down. He sat down on a log by the road and tried to compose himself. Boom! Suddenly he was struck again. Robert watched as John's face and body seemed to seize and contort. Just then, they could hear the sound of maniacal laughing, as if the wind itself was laughing. It was as if there was a chorus of voices swirling around them, laughing and rejoicing at John's misery. Tears streamed down John's face, and with what energy he could muster, John said to Robert,
"Oh, my son, not long will you have a father to wait on so patiently. I cannot much longer survive the persecutions of this terrible thing. It is killing me by slow tortures, and I feel that the end is nigh."
John and Robert prayed together, and as some time passed, the voices began to grow faint and finally subsided. John was able to get enough strength to walk the rest of the way home, but while John was able to make his way around the house, he would rarely actually leave the inside of the home again until his death. A couple months later, on the morning of December 19th, the witch collected her due. That morning, the family noticed that John was late to rise. They checked on him and found him unresponsive. Doctors were called, and it was determined that he was in a dire state, but he was still lightly breathing. But when John Jr. went to the medicine cabinet to get some medicine for his father, he discovered a strange vial that was about 2/3 full of some smoky liquid. Everyone in the family examined the bottle, but none of them had seen it before. And the doctor who was present smelled the liquid inside of it, but was unable to determine what it was, and he thought it might be poison, but they needed to test it. So buckle up, because here's a shitty moment.
Oh, no.
They caught a cat that was on the property. I don't know if it was one of their pets or just a cat that was on the property. They dipped a piece of straw into the bottle and fed it to the cat. The cat apparently kicked around for a bit and quickly died, so yes, it was poison.
Oh, God.
But that's when the voice of the witch came cackling, saying,
"It's useless for you to try and relieve old Jack. I've got him this time. He will never get up from that bed again."
When they asked about the vial found in the medicine cabinet, the witch responded,
"I put it there and gave old Jack a big dose out of it last night while he was asleep, which fixed him."
That was all the information they could get out of the witch.
Wow.
The rest of the day, John Bell lay there unconscious, all the while his condition worsening. Finally, the next morning on December 20th, John Bell passed away with his family by his side. The moment that he did, the witch broke into song and celebration. She would leave the family in peace, though, until once the burial was complete. But the moment the burial was done and the family was walking away, she once again broke out into a song, into a rendition of "Roll Me Up Some Brandy-O." And just a quick note that's interesting. As awful as this witch was to John and Betsy and nearly everyone, like we said before, it absolutely adored Lucy Bell, the mother.
Mm-hmm.
You see, Lucy had actually gotten rather sick around the same time that John Bell did. But while John was tormented, the witch would constantly comfort Lucy. It would sing her hymns and recite scripture to her. Mysteriously, nuts and berries from the forest would appear out of nowhere on Lucy's bed. Truly did have an affection for her, and of course, Lucy did get better.
That's so interesting and so weird.
I know,
wonder why
right?
that is.
So bizarre. Well, the main part of this witch's work was apparently done, but she did stick around for a few months more, even though her overall power seemed to be subsiding. She did have one last piece of business to attend to, though, and that was making sure that Betsy did not marry her suitor, Joshua Gardner. In the spring of 1821, after constant physical beatings to both Joshua and Betsy, Betsy's will finally broke, and she broke off her courtship with Joshua.
Oh no, that's so sad. What the
And almost immediately after that, the witch's power subsided. But before it left, it made a fond farewell to Lucy Bell, saying it would return briefly in exactly 7 years. Well, here's an interesting thing we're going to touch on again in a moment. As if there weren't enough creeps in this story already, Betsy's school teacher, who was much older than her, a Richard Powell, had apparently fallen in love with her.
Oh my God, this is so heinous.
In 1824, John Bell died in 1820, and then the witch officially left in the spring of 1821. In 1824, she ended up marrying Richard Powell, and this is after, obviously, she had broken it off with Joshua. Well, she would only be bothered again by the witch once, which we'll get to in a moment. But the witch, to Lucy, was true to her word. In exactly 7 years from when it left, it returned, but for only 2 weeks. She caused a bit of nuisance, but nothing like she did before, and after 2 weeks, it left. And there's one more twist I'm going to save, because I want to talk about theories first. Let's discuss some theories. Well, if you're a skeptic, obviously one main theory is that it was all fake. Who knows? With that aside, let's get into some interesting theories. Because there are some interesting theories that pertain to it being both real and natural causes that are both very interesting.
Right, totally. Like we've said so many times, just because some parts of it aren't true doesn't mean that the true parts are any less exciting.
Right. Well, one natural explanation was that it was actually Betsy's teacher, Robert Powell, behind it all. He had known Betsy since she was only 11, not too long before the witch appeared. Is it possible that Powell was driving the family nuts? But consider this, it was at its worst when Betsy was being courted by Joshua Gardner.
Right.
It would beg her not to marry Joshua.
Right. But it's just like, how would he do it, though?
And that's the other thing. And at the moment she called it off with Joshua, well, that was when the witch pretty much left.
Right. Like, the timing makes a lot of sense. And this guy seems like a fucking weirdo.
It would be yeah, that's a good point. Well,
Yeah.
it would be reasonable to ask, though, like you said, how could he
Yeah.
pull off such an elaborate haunting for years without ever getting caught?
Right.
Well, as we know, Betsy wasn't plagued again. So about 12 years after Betsy married her teacher, apparently there begun to be strange noises on the walls and on the roof. Started off a lot like the original shit did. Well, Powell wanted to nip this in the bud, and apparently he took Betsy to, I guess, a hypnotherapist of that day, a hypnotist of some kind. And under hypnosis, Betsy apparently made some incredible revelations. And that revelation was that the entity was in fact created by Betsy to protect her from her father, who at the age of 12 had begun molesting her at night.
Oh, fuck.
This is apparently what came out in these sessions.
Oh my God. I mean, that does make me think even more about poltergeist activity.
Right.
Because there's all this intense emotional strife going on, as well as just a teen being a teenager.
Exactly.
And that energy being there.
Exactly. Very good point. And apparently, while she was under hypnosis, she spoke in the voice of Jerusalem, one of those four entities, that boy. Consider her age. This would have started happening right when the haunting started.
Right.
Apparently, it also said that, like, when it would rip the covers off of people, it was mocking the way John Bell would pull the covers off of her.
Oh, shit.
It is interesting to think about. Consider Betsy's age. All of the main theories we know about what poltergeists are, this would have put her at the appropriate age.
Right.
She's going through something horrible with her father.
Right.
And consider that the horrors of slavery happening all around them. So if we go by this theory that poltergeists they feed off of negative energy, what you've got here is a fucking buffet.
Yes.
It is an all-you-can-eat buffet of misery.
Yeah, I mean, this place is hell. And it makes sense that something like that at a certain point would just snap. And all of a sudden, you have access to this other side or to these energies or something like that. Like, maybe she actually was doing all of these things herself, like Betsy was doing it, but maybe it wasn't just Betsy alone. It was like something working through Betsy.
Right.
Or maybe it really was Betsy doing it all subconsciously or unconsciously as well, I guess.
Right.
I mean, that's also incredibly interesting as well.
Exactly.
But I think, like you said, where it's like these things, it's kind of like an entity, just some kind of negative entity or even a tulpa or something like that. Like, these poltergeists can just really go off the rails. Because it's not just like a regular poltergeist, it's also going the fuck after John. Exactly.
It's especially getting John. And in a weird way, it's also abusing Betsy. Because who knows, as a child, when you're a child, maybe she thinks in a weird way she deserves that treatment or something.
Right.
And also, considering the environment, it's no surprise that this entity was really racist. Because it's surrounded by race. It makes sense that if this was a creation of one of them, that it would inherit probably some of their beliefs and whatnot.
Right. And maybe she made the poison and gave it to her dad and was totally unaware that she did it, or maybe she was kind of aware that she did it. Right. I don't know.
Maybe John Bell did it to himself. Maybe he was in so much pain that, who knows? We call it a witch, but I don't think Kate Batts has anything to do. Personally, I don't think she has anything to do.
Yeah, I don't really think so either. I mean, unless if maybe she also, her strong intention and her willing of something bad to happen to John, I mean, maybe that didn't help the situation.
Right.
But yeah, I think that this was like a poltergeist that just got out of hand.
And there's theories that maybe this was an early example of dissociative identity disorder. Someone who's under a severe amount of trauma, you create these personalities that sort of defend you. And if that's not the case, are we to assume that these other entities, were they individual entities, or were these also kind of, all part of Betsy's psychosis?
Right.
If that's even what this is.
Right. I don't know. There's just so much about this story that is fascinating, and it really makes you wonder what really went on.
And consider, why did Betsy not want to tell anyone that the witch had saved that boy?
Yeah, do we know why that was?
Why would she not want to say when it had done something quote unquote good? Like, why? I don't know.
I was wondering about that too. It's like maybe she felt, I don't know, she didn't like the witch. She wanted the witch gone, so she didn't want to say anything positive about it or something. Because maybe, I don't think she was like aware that the witch was coming from her. She probably,
exactly.
Yeah, so she didn't really realize that it kind of worked that way. Not that she was practicing witchcraft or whatever.
Well, by this, you don't even have, even if it does come from you don't even have control over it. It becomes this separate, intelligent thing.
It just starts from you, basically.
Exactly. Also, like, who is this little girl that would hang from the trees and talk to her?
Yeah. Was that, maybe that was a ghost?
I don't know.
Or that was some kind of trick?
Here's the thing. Today, a lot of people know the Bell Witch because of the Bell Witch Cave. But that cave where that boy accidentally got buried and saved, it's one of those things that was kind of minor to the actual story, but for whatever reason has kind of captivated people. Now, like, if you go on Discovery Plus, there's tons of like ghost adventure specials and other shows where they go to like Bell Witch Cave.
Yeah, we haven't done a Discovery Plus plug in a minute. I'm glad we're back on it.
And our patrons, we're going to give them some more Bell Witch stuff because there's all sorts of modern day tales of hauntings that are happening there.
Right.
This is the original story, but our Patreon listeners this month are going to get a more deeper dive into more recent events dealing with the witch.
I mean, what a bizarre, freaky, just like classic story.
What an incredible history lesson.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much for doing all of that fantastic research.
Of course, thank you.
An amazing, fun episode, and I'm so happy that we got to share this story with all of you today.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We are very, very grateful to have you here. And you know what? Let me treat you to some poetry real quick.
Oh, I can't wait.
We have a newcomer to the Patreon
Yay,
list.
welcome. We're so happy to have you. Yay.
We'll get to that. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Via Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Vivacious Vicky McHugh, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the Oh-So-Suave Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker Bex Martin, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, and the newcomer, the Killer Stud, Carl Stahl.
Wow, Carl, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
We are so happy to have you as a part of the Creep Street Homeowners Association.
Thank you so much, Carl, and enjoy that bonus content.
Yes, please. If you'd like to be like them, feel free to check us out at patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast. Another way to help support the show is just to like, rate, subscribe, share on social media, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers. Little things like that really help spread the show, and it really means the world to us, and we so appreciate it.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night and goodbye.
Bye.